Welcome, Magda Mostafa, for this short talk that we have. Thank you so much for being here and your presentation. You talked in the speech you had about so-called reversed inclusion. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit more about what is reversed inclusion?
Well, reversed inclusion is a provocation, really. It's taking this idea that for so long we prioritize the needs of what we call normal. These standards of people who are able to move through space independently. The standard typically is very gendered as well, so it's around the male form and the male ability. And there are lots of examples of problems with that we only have one kind of standard that we design everything for, from furniture to products, to architecture, to space, to cities and transportation, everything.
And why is that? Are there too many men just following the same path of architecture, or why is that?
I'm not sure. I mean, you'll have to ask the sociologists, but I'm sure it's a parallel argument to everything else that we see that is of the normative standard first. It may be also because of the modern school of architecture that was very Industrial Revolution informed. Mm-hmm. So it was a very mechanical way of seeing what architecture is. And in an attempt that was very noble at the time to boil everything down to a single set of standards and sizes so we can guarantee that every building functioned the way it was supposed to function. So the intent behind it, I think, was an intent of efficiency, but in doing so, it excluded so many people. And we're seeing now with the civil rights and ability advocacies of the 60s and the 70s and accessibility becoming part of that narrative. So it's now expanded to include other forms of ability, but that expansion has to stretch to include autism now as well.
Exactly, because we're talking about autism today, the whole day. Now, when you would look at a building environment, a built environment, what would be the visible discrepancies between, say, the normals that you mm-hmm. say doesn't exist and people with autism? What would you change in the environment?
Well, one of the first things I would change isn't something you would necessarily see, but it's something that you would hear. Acoustics plays such a huge role in how we subconsciously navigate space and exist within space. And someone who is closer to the center typical part of the spectrum may have the ability to filter that out or to ignore and focus their attention on what they need to focus, but they're still doing a mental effort of taking that noise away. We're in a quiet room now, but if we had done this outside, we would have to mentally filter out that sound. And people with different abilities may not have that ability to the extent that they may be disabled to have that conversation. So one of the first things I always like to think about is acoustics. Spatial sequencing is also huge. We could design our buildings in a way that's more logical, that as we move through space, so we don't have to move through one space to get to another. Mm-hmm. There's a more clear, efficient way to get to spaces. We could also organize things around the logical flow of how you need to operate through space. And I give always this commercially driven model. So for example, in shopping centers, I'm sure you've been to shopping centers where you take the escalator down, but in order to take it down to the next level, you have to go all the way around. Right. And as someone who works in PR or marketing understands, that's to expose you to as many shopping opportunities to get to your destination. So even if you wanted to go zoo down the mall, you couldn't do that. You would have to be forced to be exposed. Maybe you'll buy something along the way. The problem with that from the autistic perspective is we're exposing that individual to so much more stimulation than they need, to the extent that they may never be able to navigate independently through the mall because they're constantly being bombarded with this additional sensory input that is put there for a economical, financial gain reason, ignoring that it also overloads someone in their sensory perspective to an extent that that space may be inaccessible to them.
So we could even say that autism is something that would help us identify sensitivities of things that we all have, so that when we would build, like in the sense of helping autistic people feeling well, we would also do something for us all, right?
Absolutely. And I think the secret to that formula is this idea of flexibility and choice. So I think spectrum thinking is a very good model of thinking, whether it's about people's abilities and your question about the normal and where that is and where we fall on the spectrum, but also about design and about space. So going back to the retail example, to give an alternative pathway that's more direct, that's less sensory overload, that's clearer to navigate, that's easier to navigate, but also giving the alternative, because it's not fair you won't be able to rent the shop that's too far away from the escalators if you don't have that forced circulation pathway. So and those two models can exist in a design solution. That's what design is supposed to do. Mm-hmm. The problem isn't with the design tools we have. The problem is with the number of variables that we consider worthy of consideration. So it's not only about being able to rent that shop space and being able to create opportunity for someone to buy something from that shop, which is an important objective, but equally important is to allow the choice and the flexibility for someone on the spectrum to be able to move through a retail space that is a public space that everyone should enjoy. Mm-hmm. And they may very well enjoy if it's created in a way for them. Airports is another place that's huge. I mean, a lot of families that I know and that I've worked with children with autism, travel for them is one of the most challenging things. Yeah. Although they want to expose their child to different experiences and visit different places and see different people, but to get there, like the example I gave about the gentleman coming to the UN on the train, getting there is such a hurdle. It's just as difficult as a set of stairs would be for someone on a wheelchair. It's that much of a barrier. So if we think about space differently, we need to create, and as a designer, we just need to add those autistic needs to the menu of things that designers are constantly prioritizing and coordinating and designing for. So it's not a difficult task, because that's what we as designers are trained to do. Take these complicated needs and find one solution that works for all of them.
Yeah. We are here in Switzerland, and Switzerland is very proud of its design, which is really quite famous, of their architects. Yes. There are some very famous ones. And the interesting thing is, when it comes to everything we discuss now, we are far, far, far behind. Why is that?
I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know. I think part of it is because there's a flip side to everything. I think policy plays a big role, and how decisions are made and how policy is implemented is very decentralized. You have a decentralized government. So there are pros and cons to different policy-making systems. I'm not a policymaker, but I have to intersect with policies a lot of times in order to find a pathway to get things that we need built, actually built. Part of it in my conversations have been that the decision is distributed across these decentralized points of decision-making processes. And the challenge there is that even if one area is getting it right, it doesn't automatically scale up to everything else. So there isn't as much top-down policy and legislation. That's one of the problems, perhaps specific to Switzerland. But I think generally around the world, that example you gave about web design is an excellent example. So we now have legislation in place that says all publicly accessible websites for universities or schools or government institutions must be accessible. Yeah. But then what does that mean for the autism community? What does an accessible website look like? We know perhaps what it looks like for someone with hearing impairment or visual impairment or a mobility challenge, and we can have assistive technologies for that. I would love to get into the conversation of what it looks like for someone on the autism spectrum. Mm-hmm. So part of it also is just that we haven't quite come up with the tools. The other challenge is that because autism is a spectrum, that tools that work for one area in one instance for one group doing one thing may not necessarily work for another. So it's very much about customizing. And that's why what I said this morning is that aspects is a way of thinking about the problem. It's not a set of tools and guidelines to make the room this big and this shape and this color with this furniture layout. There's some of that, but it's a proposal that's through the lens of think about what it sounds like, think about what it feels like, think about what it's like to move through it, tell the story of the day in the life of using that space so you can design it better. That's
exactly how they do it with web design. Now, my last question would be, would it help when in the education or architects and designers, there would be much more of this narrative and much less the focus whether something looks nice or which is probably more important, is also profitable.
Right. I think, again, it's not a question of eliminating the economics of design from the discussion, and it's not about eliminating the aesthetics of design from discussion, but it's about expanding what it is that we consider to be good design, and also what we consider our responsibility to design for. So I would love to see this kind of thinking come more into the education, and that's why in my position on the Education Commission at UNESCO, at the International Union of Architects, it's something that I would like to see coming in to how we educate our future architects. But it's not either or. It's not one thing or the other. And there's a wonderful quote by a brilliant Egyptian architect, Hassan Fathi. He's world renowned for his wonderful vernacular work for the poor. But he, on the topic of that it looks nice, always said, beauty is the good doing of what needs doing.
Fantastic. I think this was the best word to end this fantastic conversation. Magda, thank you so much.
Thank you, Casper,
for being here, and thank you for your contribution. That was absolutely valuable.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Casper.